Oh, so that's why people are afraid of bears. Five Nights at Freddy's might be the most iconic horror franchise of the 21st century, with an ever-growing amount of games, novels, fanworks, let's plays, and now a movie that's definitely getting sequels. Also this Glamrock Freddy backpack that I found in GameStop and this Glamrock Freddy hat that I found in Hot Topic. I did the math and all of that adds up to approximately way more than 5 nights. They should rename the series to a life sentence at Freddy's. But let's talk about what led to that verdict, because for how successful it has such humble beginnings, and I find the story of its development so inspiring. Scott Cawthon was having little success as a game developer in Texas. He created his very first game as a teenager using ClickTeam Fusion back in 1994 when it was called Click and Play. In his adult life, he created a few Christian games, including his first official game, Legacy of Flynn, in 2003. While his games were received well, they didn't make him a lot of money, so in order to make ends meet, he also worked at places like Dollar General and Target, as well as working on a few animated Christian videos. In 2013, he released a landmark title in his game development career, Chipper & Sons Lumber Co., and what's notable about this game is people's reactions to the unintentionally scary-looking character designs, which looked like animatronics. At first, this sent Scott into a pit of depression and even a crisis in faith, as stated by Scott himself. And after his life insurance policy canceled, it worsened. In a moment of desperation, he asked for God to use him somehow, and afterwards, he had a remarkably creative idea that would not only save his career, but redefine it. He could make a new game where the entire premise revolves around the intentionally scary-looking character designs that are literal animatronics. So on August 8th, 2014, he released Five Nights at Freddy's, the game with that exact idea behind it. You're a night guard at basically Chuck E. Cheese and you have to keep watch of the intentionally scary animatronics, otherwise they just might keep watch of you and then surprise hug you and mutilate you. But I think we can all agree that the scariest part of this game is being in the workforce. This game completely took over the internet, and fast. Everyone made Let's Play videos, which spread the word about the game, which led to more Let's Plays, which spread the word about the game even more. And it helps that it has a lot of jump scares, because watching people scream at bears is funny. It got to the point where the Let's Plays were arguably more popular than the game itself, but either way it led to a lot of people buying the game, which led to Scott Cawthon creating 3 sequels in the span of less than a year. There was also more after that, but I stopped keeping track at that point. People complain about the sequels being lazy cash grabs, and yeah, maybe, but anyone would have done the same thing. And I think it's kind of impressive how fast he made the games considering he's one guy. The series is still going strong today, but Scott has since retired from working on it. The fandom became the internet's punching bag for a while because of weird fan art or whatever. You know how fandoms are sometimes. But if you ask me, a lot of the appeal of the series actually comes from the community surrounding it. Earlier, I mentioned the Let's Plays and fanworks, and regarding that second point, there's the fan songs from people like The Living Tombstone, fan games, fan-made 3DS ports of the first 4 games, normal fan art, memes, and the cryptic lore of the series led to a lot of fan theories. Notice how all of that is community-driven. With that being said, I also think the game itself exploded in popularity for a reason. It's very creative in terms of concept and gameplay, especially for its time. 2 of the biggest indie horror games from the early 2010s are Slender and Outlast, and in my opinion, they kind of play it safe in terms of their whole setup. Slender takes place in the woods at night, and Outlast takes place in an abandoned hospital. You know, settings that were practically invented to be used in early 2010s indie horror games. So it was kinda novel for Five Nights at Freddy's to take place in a Chuck E. Cheese-esque restaurant where the animatronics are literally evil. And like I said earlier, it was a very creative way to respond to the criticism of his previous game. Yes, it does use a lot of jump scares, which can be a lazy way to scare someone in a horror game, but the ambient sounds build them up really well. And not being able to move or fight the animatronics adds to the sense of helplessness that the player feels, while also being an efficient way to make the game on a tight budget. Also, the gameplay is fun in my opinion. If I was in this situation in real life, I'd probably think to myself, ha 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 ha, yes, this is fun, other than, you know, the primal fear of being in the workforce. I consider myself to be a casual fan, with the first 2 games being my favorites. I played through the first game on an iPhone 4 back in 2014, I played the demos of the first 2 games on the family computer, I watched a few of the theory videos, but that's just a theory, and I still listen to some of the fan songs to this day, with my favorite one being It's Been So Long. The game came out as I was entering 7th grade, and I discovered it with Teens React to Five Nights at Freddy's. I remember talking about the series a lot with my friends at school. There was a time someone turned to ask what we were talking about, we said FNAF, and they cringed. There was a time I was bored in class and I wrote out the lyrics to The Living Tombstone's first Five Nights at Freddy's song because I was bored in class and I liked the song. But most importantly, there was a time one of my friends told us about the announcement of a full-blown FNAF movie to be released in theaters. Yes, he was talking about what would eventually become this movie. The announcement was all the way back in April of 2015, over 8 years before the film ended up releasing. In those 8 years, the series has lost and regained its popularity multiple times. The comments of old videos have started to fill with nostalgic FNAF veterans. The movie went through multiple rewrites and production changes, and I've gone from being a 7th grader to being a senior in college. After all of that, the movie is finally out. I thought it was decent. Usually I try to avoid talking about spoilers, but for this movie, a lot of what I have to say about it is kinda spoilery, so if that matters to you, I'd suggest watching the movie first. And I should also mention that I've never read any of the books, and my grasp on the lore has kind of fallen off over the years. And with that said, I chose to watch this movie in theaters. From what I saw, there were a lot of teenagers and young adults in the audience, along with some families. I thought the tonal whiplash from the Thanksgiving trailer to the Migration trailer was pretty funny, but after that I got bored for the rest of the previews and I wrote out the lyrics to the Living Tombstones FNAF song. I'm kidding, I drew digital circus fan art. We open with the death of a security guard, who would have been played by Markiplier, otherwise known as the King of Five Nights at Freddy's, but he was unable to accept the role because he was working on his own movie at the time of filming. And then after admittedly a pretty cool opening credits sequence, we cut to our protagonist Mike Schmidt, played by Josh Hutcherson, who's known for such classics as Bridge to Terabithia, The Hunger Games, Josh Hutcherson whistle edits, and who could forget Trapped in an Island with Josh Hutcherson. He works as a mall cop until one day he beats up a child kidnapper. Or so he thought. Turns out it was just a dad telling his kid it was time to go home. Apparently, this is not an isolated incident for Mike, as when he was a little kid, his family went on a camping trip where his brother Garrett was taken away and never seen again. And that event has weighed on him ever since. Steve Raglan, Mike's career counselor, is losing patience with him because of how often he finds himself in incidents like this. His employment options are practically non-existent, except for a night watchman job for Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. And on top of this, he and his Aunt Jane are in a custody battle over Abby, his 10-year-old sister. So at this point I'm thinking, okay, this movie has a decent setup, the Balloon Boy jump scare was pretty funny. But then Mike just decides to sleep on the job. Look, I know Markiplier said the first night's never usually that bad in any of the games, but that was right before he got jump scared. I don't know. My point is, it feels a little reckless to fall asleep in an abandoned restaurant with animatronics in it. Maybe he just really believes in the importance of sleep, which is absolutely fair. Or maybe he realizes he's in a PG-13 movie, so they can't hurt him that bad. But actually, the real reason is that after the disappearance of Garrett, he's gotten into a routine of taking sleeping pills and listening to nature sounds to bring him back to that day in his dreams so he can get a lead on who took Garrett. But when he does this at the real Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, he instead encounters the spirits of 5 dead children, corresponding with the animatronics. The next day, Aunt Jane meets with a group of people she's bribing to sabotage Mike because she's literally evil. They decide on breaking a bunch of stuff at the already abandoned Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. That'll show him. What a great mother figure. This is actually my favorite scene in the movie. And yes, it is solely because the restaurant waiter was played by Matt Pat from Game Theory, who made quite a lot of FNAF theories. They also managed to slip in the line, "That's just a theory," which is not only an amazing nod to the fans who do get it, but it's subtle enough that it doesn't alienate non-fans, which is exactly how you should do a reference. And with the recent news of Matt Pat retiring, there's now a hint of bittersweetness to the scene. We didn't know it at the time of release, but this would end up being one of the last things that Matt Pat did while still working full-time on Game Theory. But it's also quite fitting, considering that FNAF is easily his longest and arguably his most iconic set of theories. On night 2, Mike tries to have the dream again, but then he's visited by Vanessa the police officer. Kind of out of nowhere too, I don't think it's explained. Maybe she has some kind of homing device for people in need of exposition. What she does have is a PhD in FNAF lore, but nobody was hiring in that field because it was 14 years away from existing, so she became a police officer. Regardless, explaining FNAF lore is her true calling in life, so she decides to do so with Mike. She explains how Freddy Fazbear's Pizza is totally real and it was wildly popular in the 80s. That is, until they were forced to shut down because the deaths of 5 children were tied to the restaurant. On an unrelated note, she turns on the animatronics show. After Mike and Vanessa leave, the group goes in to enact their plans of destroying the place. And as I'm sure you would have guessed, they all die very off-screen deaths at the hands of the animatronics, mostly the cupcake. Except for Aunt Jane, who didn't die, and Max the babysitter, who had the most visible and gruesome death. This is especially unfortunate because Max babysat Abby for Mike. For whatever reason, Abby's been wanting to tag along with Mike during his night shift. Maybe she wants to tell her classmates about how her brother works at the real Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. He's been refusing, but with Max gone, he has no choice but to take her with him.
Still, he tells her not to leave the office, which she disregards when he goes to sleep. How does she have that much energy? Mike gets woken up by the sound of Abby screaming, but it turns out everything's okay. The animatronics were just tickling her. Wait, what? The movie portrays this as something innocent and endearing, but imagine being tickled by a robot. I physically cringed at that scene. Maybe that guy from middle school was onto something. While we're at it, would you trust a bear in a top hat to serve you pizza? And also, what's Faz supposed to mean? I can't find it in the dictionary, but maybe mine's just, faulty. On night 4, we have Mike, Vanessa, and Abby in the infamous fort building scene. The animatronics build a fort out of tables with Mike, Vanessa, and Abby. They play Fortnite. This is probably the most controversial scene in the movie. On one hand, there's people who say that it ruined the tone of the movie, but on the other hand, you have people saying that the animatronics are possessed by the spirits of dead children, so they're gonna want to play like children. I think both arguments are valid, but I'm definitely leaning towards the first point. On a conceptual level, I think the idea that vengeful spirits of children are still gonna want to play like children is kind of unique. And not just that, but it ties in thematically with the Living Tombstone's FNAF song, which they did use for the credits, and that was absolutely the right choice. And it makes sense for them to be allies because they were killed by the same guy who took Garrett. But the problem is, there isn't really any build-up, they're just suddenly friendly if your definition of friendly is robots that tickle you.
And the whole thing just kind of felt like an episode of Barney and Friends.
One of my notes for this scene is just a bunch of question marks. But that's not to say I didn't enjoy the scene at least a little bit on an ironic level. It was insane in kind of a funny way, and if nothing else, I'm not gonna forget about it anytime soon. Also during this scene, a big group of people walked into the theater. They must have been so confused. Vanessa tells Mike about the yellow bunny costume that the killer would wear, and how with the spring lock feature it doubles as an animatronic. Abby gets an electrical shock from Bonnie's guitar out of nowhere. And also, speaking of out of nowhere, Vanessa threatens to shoot Mike if he ever brings Abby back to Freddy's. Yeah, of course, I love water guns. That's how he should have responded. Mike has another dream where he encounters the kids, and the kid who's the counterpart to Freddy ominously tells him they want Abby. So now it's a 3-way custody battle. On the 5th night, Freddy shows up to Abby's house to take her back to the restaurant and also presumably kill Aunt Jane, bringing it back down to a 2-way custody battle. And Vanessa reveals the identity of the man in the yellow bunny costume who killed the 5 children and Garrett. William Afton, her father, also known in the fandom as Purple Guy due to his appearance in the FNAF 2 minigames. She also revealed that when he killed the 5 children, he stuffed their bodies into the animatronics. So why did she put on the show earlier? Why was she so enthusiastic about them? Why did she play Fortnite with them? Anyway, William Afton has a way of influencing the animatronics. There's a wall with a bunch of kid drawings, including one of the yellow rabbit holding hands with 5 kids. And he's attempting to use his power over them to make Abby join them. He also shows up to the restaurant in costume out of nowhere, because I guess he heard Vanessa talking about him. He takes off the mask, which also revealed that he was Steve Raglan, and he starts attacking Mike and Vanessa. Abby draws a new picture, which more accurately portrays the yellow bunny as the killer. The animatronics stare at him as his suit locks up while he's still wearing it, stabbing him multiple times, and easily the best death scene in the movie. Freddy roars and then Mike gets custody of Abby, the end. This is another Mario movie situation where a lot of people are debating on whether this movie's even good, and in general, audiences seem to enjoy it a lot more than critics. But across the board, it seems to be scoring a little bit lower, and I can kind of see why. To start on a positive note, it looks great. The cinematography is really well done, and they get major points for hiring the Jim Henson Company to make the animatronics practically. And I even think the plot's pretty good too. They had a lot of really intricate lore to work with, and they managed to make something that was pretty emotionally resonant, especially with Mike's backstory. But the dialogue was kinda generic, most of the performances were so-so, and there are a few aspects of the plot that are kinda dumb. Like, was it really necessary to make William Afton Vanessa's father? He's already a career counselor and a murderer. But actually, having him be Mike's career counselor makes things more personal because he's the one who killed Garrett, whereas I don't think they did anything with the plot point of him being Vanessa's dad. In my opinion, it also felt like something out of a meme. And as for Vanessa, I don't really have a problem with her explaining the lore of the movie. But again, I think it's a little weird how inconsistent her attitude is towards the animatronics. Also the Fortnite scene. So it's well written, but it's not well written, if that makes any sense. I mentioned the performances being so-so, but the best performances in the movie are Josh Hutcherson as Mike and Matthew Lillard as William Afton. And MatPat, of course. Josh Hutcherson has a very emotionally driven role, and you can feel that in his performance. And having Matthew Lillard be a villain in disguise is absolutely legendary because he played Shaggy in the live-action Scooby-Doo movies, and Scooby-Doo has that whole shtick of having villains in disguise. With it being a horror movie, I feel like it kind of underdelivered on being scary. I will admit I don't watch a lot of horror stuff because I live in fear. Actually, I just never really made an effort to get into horror. Other than this movie, the closest I've gotten was watching Stranger Things, or creepypasta readings on YouTube, and channels like Mr. Nightmare if that counts. To the movie's credit, it does have a few scenes that are legitimately tense. For example, there's the scenes where Mike gets injured in his dreams and the injury shows up in real life. Also the scene where the children tell Mike they want Abby, and actually the whole climax. But aside from that, I felt like it could have just gone a little bit further. Like, the games are a lot better at building tension, but I guess that's to be expected since they're inherently more immersive. And stuff like the really clumsy execution of the Fortnite scene didn't help either.
Also, giving the animatronics glowing red eyes was really cheesy.
A lot of the deaths were off-screen, which to be fair is also true about the games. But one defining part of the games that really isn't in the movie that much is jump scares. I think it's kind of weird that the only jump scares in the movie are used for the Balloon Boy gag, which was decently funny, but that's the only use of jump scares in the movie. Something they nailed is showing how scary the workforce is. Like, you could fall asleep at work. And there's also the fact that William Afton needs 3 jobs to stay afloat, being a
Career counselor, a father, and a murderer. He's a triple threat.
It's rated PG-13, and if it weren't for the 2 on-screen deaths, they could have gotten away with rating this movie PG. I get why they did this. A lot of FNAF fans are kids, and the games themselves weren't excessively bloody or anything. But I also think since there's a lot of people like me who were kids when the game came out but are adults now, it would be really cool to see an R-rated FNAF movie for that audience. Though with all that said, I am glad I went to see this movie in theaters. Even just the MatPat cameo and the Living Tombstone song at the end made it worth it for me. In conclusion, does anyone want to play Fortnite?